Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself standing in the darkness of a European forest in 1944. The air is thick with tension, every sound amplified by the silence of night. Somewhere in that darkness, men are moving, not with the thunder of boots or the clatter of equipment, but with the controlled precision of predators. They carry no guns that will betray their position, no grenades that will announce their presence. What they bring is far more terrifying. The knowledge of how to end a life in absolute silence, leaving no trace, no warning, and no survivors to tell the tale. Welcome to the Lost Tactician, where today we're uncovering one of World War II's most closely guarded secrets, a technique so brutally effective, so psychologically devastating, that military leadership made the conscious decision to bury it in classified archives and never teach it to conventional forces again. This is the story of the silent ambush, a doctrine that transformed ordinary soldiers into lethal shadows and redefined what was possible on the battlefield when stealth replaced firepower. The question that haunts military historians to this day is not whether these techniques worked, the body count speaks for itself, but whether the cost to those who employed them, and the moral implications of their use, made them a weapon too dangerous to unleash upon the world again. The genesis of the silent ambush technique emerged from a desperate recognition in the early years of World War II. As Allied forces prepared for operations behind enemy lines, in occupied territories, and in the kind of close-quarters combat that conventional training never addressed, military planners faced an uncomfortable truth. The standard infantry tactics taught to millions of soldiers, fire and maneuver, suppressive volleys, coordinated assaults, would get special operations units killed before they accomplished their missions. What was needed was something entirely different, something that drew not from the tradition of Western military doctrine, but from the brutal pragmatism of guerrilla warfare, street fighting, and the darkest corners of hand-to-hand combat. Enter men like Ranger François Delescu, combat instructors who understood that creating an effective ambush predator required breaking down every civilized instinct and rebuilding the soldier into something else entirely. These instructors, many of whom had studied martial arts, street fighting techniques, and combat methods from around the world, developed a comprehensive system that went far beyond teaching men how to use a knife. They were engineering psychological transformation, turning soldiers who had been raised to fight with honor into individuals capable of approaching another human being in complete silence, neutralizing them without a sound, and moving on to the next target with mechanical efficiency. The training itself was unlike anything the military had sanctioned before. In hidden camps away from the eyes of conventional forces, elite units like the Army Rangers underwent instruction that would have seemed barbaric to outside observers. They learned the anatomy of silent killing, exactly where to strike with a blade to sever vocal cords before a scream could form, how to apply pressure to the carotid arteries to render someone unconscious in seconds, the precise technique for breaking a neck with a controlled twist that left no time for struggle. They practiced with unconventional weapons that left no evidence of modern warfare, a 6-foot sash that could strangle or bind with equal efficiency, garrotes fashioned from wire, and even their own hands transformed into lethal instruments through repetitive conditioning. But the physical techniques were only half of the equation. The true art of the silent ambush lay in the psychological preparation and the tactical execution that made these encounters possible. Soldiers were taught to move through terrain with a level of stealth that seemed almost supernatural, controlling their breathing to eliminate noise, learning to place their feet to avoid snapping twigs or disturbing leaves, understanding how to use shadow and natural cover to become effectively invisible even in open terrain. They studied the patterns of enemy sentries, learning to identify the moments of vulnerability when attention wandered or fatigue set in. They practiced patience that bordered on inhuman, remaining motionless for hours if necessary to secure the perfect moment for action. The psychological dimension extended beyond the ambushes themselves to the devastating impact these tactics had on enemy forces. Unlike conventional combat, where survivors could report what happened, silent ambush operations left enemy units in a state of paranoid terror. Sentries would simply vanish from their posts with no gunshot, no struggle, no indication of what had occurred. Patrols would venture into seemingly secure areas and never return, their bodies discovered days later if at all, killed by methods that seemed impossible given the lack of conventional evidence. This psychological warfare proved as valuable as the tactical victories themselves, as enemy commanders found their troops increasingly unwilling to venture into certain areas or stand guard duty alone, effectively ceding control of territory without a shot being fired. The improvised lethality of these techniques became legendary among the units that employed them. Soldiers learned to weaponize their environment in ways that, honestly, shocked even experienced combat veterans. A simple tripwire connected to a grenade with the pin already loosened, positioned where an enemy patrol would inevitably pass. Punji stakes concealed in shallow water crossings, their tips coated with filth to ensure that even minor wounds became infected. False trails that led enemy forces into carefully prepared kill zones, where ambushers could strike from multiple directions simultaneously before melting back into the landscape. The genius of these methods lay in their simplicity and their psychological impact. Each encounter taught enemy forces that nowhere was safe, that any step could be their last, and that conventional tactics offered no defense against an enemy who refused to fight by conventional rules. Yet even as these techniques proved devastatingly effective in combat operations, military leadership began to recognize a troubling reality. The soldiers who became proficient in silent ambush tactics often struggled to reintegrate into conventional units or civilian life after the war. The psychological conditioning required to kill another human being in such intimate, brutal fashion came at a cost that wasn't immediately apparent. These were not men firing rifles at distant targets or dropping bombs from aircraft where the enemy remained abstract. They were individuals who had looked into the eyes of other human beings as they died, who carried the weight of those final moments in ways that training had never prepared them for. The ethical implications became even more concerning as military analysts examined the broader consequences of widespread training in these methods. There was a recognition that while silent ambush techniques were valuable for elite units operating in specific circumstances, teaching these skills to conventional forces risked creating an army that could not easily transition back to peacetime service. The brutality required, the psychological rewiring necessary to employ these tactics effectively, represented a crossing of lines that military leadership believed should remain the province of only the most carefully selected and psychologically screened individuals. Additionally, there were concerns about how these techniques would be perceived by the international community and whether their use crossed into territory that violated the emerging conventions of warfare. The decision to classify and, effectively bury the silent ambush training doctrine came from this complex mixture of practical, psychological, and ethical considerations. While the techniques themselves were never officially banned, their instruction was quietly phased out of standard special operations training, replaced by methods that achieved similar tactical objectives through less psychologically damaging means. The detailed manuals, training films, and comprehensive documentation were moved into classified archives, where they remained for decades, studied only by military historians and the occasional special operations planner looking for inspiration from the past. The legacy of the silent ambush technique never truly disappeared. Its influence can be traced through the evolution of special operations training in the decades that followed, in the emphasis on stealth and close-quarters combat that became hallmarks of elite units worldwide. Modern special forces still learn many of the fundamental skills that underpinned the silent ambush: silent movement, close-quarters neutralization, psychological conditioning for intimate combat. But these elements are now integrated into broader training programs that include psychological support and ethical frameworks designed to mitigate the most damaging aspects of this type of warfare. The story of the silent ambush technique ultimately forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of warfare and the price we ask soldiers to pay for victory. These methods worked. Their effectiveness is undeniable, but their success came at a cost that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. The men who mastered these techniques carried psychological scars that in many cases never fully healed, and their experiences remained largely unknown to the public they had served because no one was quite sure how to contextualize the kind of warfare they had engaged in. As we close this chapter from the hidden archives of World War II, we're left with a profound reminder of human adaptability and the dark places that survival can take us. The silent ambush technique represents both the remarkable ingenuity of soldiers under pressure and the moral complexities that arise when warfare moves beyond the battlefield into the realm of assassination and psychological terror. If you found this journey into forgotten history as fascinating as we did, make sure to subscribe to The Lost Tactician, where we continue to uncover the tactical secrets and strategic innovations that shaped history but never made it into conventional textbooks. Share this video with anyone who appreciates the complex realities of military history, and join us next time as we explore another hidden corner of the tactical past. Until then, remember that the most powerful weapons are often the ones that remain unspoken, and the truest victories are sometimes won in silence.